Stabilsky. I'm a professor here at the OII, and I want to thank you for coming in person and online on what is shaping up to be a beautiful day in the southeast of England. Not to curse it, I don't know what I'm talking on. I'm here to introduce one of our students and one of the students who's a member of my group, Matt Sharpe, and he's going to be talking about some pretty amazing research. And there's two or three things that are amazing about it, and I'll leave him to explain it. But one is I like to pride ourselves in our research group on doing like different forms of computational social sciences grounded in the or the discipline of psychology. And at least the larger data that Matt's been working with here is about 1,000 times larger than even our millions of observations of many tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And it represents actually a really interesting interdisciplinary kind of intersection between the theories and the models that we have in cognitive, in social and personality psychology, like studying behavior through observation and through survey. And it has a real intersection with what we could think of as the methods and the tools and the kinds of thinking that we see in industry and kind of at kind of some of the bleeding edges of computational social science. Sometimes an area that doesn't have maybe as much theory or as much as substantive thinking about not just what or how have we studied things, but what is the so what of what we've studied? What might we draw back into theory and into practice? And so it's really exciting. I could say all the great companies that great industry experience you have had and you do have, but I actually think that this project itself stands on its own. And it's a subset of kind of a larger line of really fundamentally curious work that's both methodologically and kind of theory-wise quite sound. And I think you might all find interesting, but autobiographically, I find it quite interesting, which is why I'm happy that Matt's one of our, someone who I mentor for some of this, even though everything he brings me is great. And I can only then I can pick at the edges of it, sounding as if I've contributed. I'm also aware of the fact that we're not standing out in nature. So I have to read things to you that have to do with like some form of risk-based or fiduciary responsibility. So for your awareness, this event is being recorded and it will be posted on our website following the event. This presentation will run for about 30 to 40 minutes, and there will be a bit of a discussion at the end. If you're online, you can use the question and answer box. If you're in person, you will hopefully raise your hand and we'll use this microphone so that both Matt, the other people in the audience, and the people online who are joining remotely will be able to see and hear. And I would ask, because it's complicated stuff, that we will keep all questions until the end, whether those are online, leave them in the chat, we'll work through those, or in person, just so that you can stick to your 30 to 40, however long you'll need. We're not expecting any fire alarm tests during this event. So if the alarm sounds, please follow our lead and evacuate from here via the hub and then out of the building, down the staircases, not the elevators, atrium, out of following signs out of the building. For those of you not based in the building, if you need to use the toilet during the event, please speak to Ellen, who is not in this room, but she is just outside. She'll direct you and pass you through, et cetera, et cetera. And when you leave, please head back out the way you were brought up or in. In any case, I think I read that coherently enough so that you know what happens if there is a fire alarm. It is not a test, or if you have to use the facilities, there is Ellen. Without further ado, Matt, please begin.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. As Andy says, I am Matt. I am part-time DPhil student, full-time staff data scientist at Automatic. They're the people behind WordPress, Pocket Casts, Tumblr, Gravatar long reads, like a bunch of internet-y style things. Prior to that, I've worked at Spotify, at Skyscanner, at the Hook Group, at Arachnis. I've basically spent the best part of the last 15 years looking at what people do online and then trying to do something useful with that. Now, today, we're here to try to answer a very important question, which is, do you think before you open your phone? But before we get started on that, I'd like to ask you a different question. Nice, simple question, really easy. It is, about midday-ish. How many times today have you looked at your phone? We've got an answer of 10 here. At least 10. Okay. Yeah, okay.
45.
45. Okay.
Have kids.
I don't know that 45 is that many, actually.
Mm-mm.
However, this question, if you're anything like me, this question makes you a little bit uncomfortable, makes you feel a little bit awkward. Now, it's important that you should always start a talk by making the audience feel very awkward and uncomfortable. That's sort of an important thing to do. And I'd like us to, wallow in that discomfort. I'd like us to sit with it for a little bit. Let's be a little more uncomfortable. How many times will you look at your phone tomorrow? It's your phone. It's your day. And yet I imagine you're not overly happy with this as a question. It makes you feel like I'm nagging you a little bit. Now, you're all intelligent, well-educated people. I'd just like you to sit for a little bit with that cognitive dissonance. I've asked you a perfectly reasonable question. How many times are you going to look at your phone tomorrow? And yet you feel a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit judged, and a little bit awkward. We're going to come back to these questions later on, but as I say, I just like to start the talk by making everybody feel uncomfortable. So, moving on, we have to have some psychological theory because ultimately this is kind of a psychological style talk. I promise there won't be much of it, okay? So, this is a very famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman. You've probably read it. If you haven't, you should. It's good. It's a good book. In it, he introduces or talks a lot about dual process theory, about system one, system two. Ultimately, you have system one. This is the fast. This is the automatic. This is the unthinking system. This is when I'm in the kitchen, I'm chopping vegetables, and I accidentally drop a knife off of the workbench. It is the system that forces me to stick my foot out to try and catch the knife and stop it clattering on the floor. System two, the slow and deliberate and effortful system, is the one that afterwards, with a knife sticking out of my foot, says, maybe that wasn't the best thing that you could have been doing. Maybe next time, don't do that. Okay, why am I talking about system one and system two? Well, when I say, do you think when you open your phone, I'm talking here about system two. I'm talking about your slow, your deliberate, your purposeful. Are you actually cognitively engaged when you're opening your phone? Or is it all a function of system one, the fast, the automatic, the unthinking? Okay, so hopefully I'm going to tell you that this neatly leads us into what is a habit, and I'm going to require you to just sort of agree with me there. I don't know if I can self-declare this was a neat transition, but it was, I promise. So let's look at habits and the definition of a habit. Little quiz. Is a habit doing something lots of times? Is a habit doing something automatically? Is a habit the same thing as an addiction? Is a habit one weird trick that's going to solve all your problems? Or is a habit a learned automatic response to a contextual cue? Now, I'm not actually going to require you to answer this one. I think it's relatively obvious. It's the one with the long words in. However, psychologically speaking, people used to think that a habit was doing something lots of times, behavioral frequency. One of the key words in here is the word learned. So this is why doing something automatically isn't classed as a habit. Breathing isn't a habit because it's not a learned behavior. I put in one weird trick. Actually, habits are used often as kind of this weird trick that is going to teach you a new behavior, or rather you learn a habit, it reduces the cognitive effort that's required for a task, and thus it makes it easier. So actually, habits are used a lot in behavioral change. However, a habit itself isn't this one weird trick, okay? And then finally, an addiction. Now, habit and addiction are kind of related. Addiction often comes with the notion of harm. Addiction also comes with the idea of kind of moral judgment. I often like to think of habit is basically, well, an addiction is kind of a habit plus a moral judgment about that habit. I'm going to try and stay clear of moral judgment as part of this talk. Maybe you are trying to build a habit with your phone because that's where Duolingo is, that's where Audible is. There are lots of good things that you can do on your phone, and you're trying to foster these habits. Maybe you don't like how often you play Candy Crush or you play slot games, and it's actually a gambling addiction. So I'm not really going to try and apply a moral layer to this. I'm just looking at how habitually you use your phone. Okay, so how do psychologists measure a habit? Well, they have this tool. This is the self-reported habit index. This is kind of the gold standard For psychologists, it's been used hundreds, maybe even thousands of times across a whole range of things: exercise, nutrition, medicine, all kinds of activities. And it may sound fancy, it's not very fancy. It's just 12 questions. The questions are of the form: using TikTok is something that I do frequently. And you either strongly agree or agree a little bit, or you disagree. If you strongly agree, then you get, let's say, 7 points. If you strongly disagree, you get 0 points. At the end, we add up all of the points, we take the average, and that is your habit score. That is how strongly habitual your behavior is. Important point to note here, this is self-reported. That comes with a lot of baggage. Ultimately, psychologists are careful not to use the word habit in any of these questions, but if you squint a little bit, something that I do automatically, something that's part of my routine, these sound a bit like habit. So you could argue that what psychologists do is actually say, hey, do you have a habit with TikTok? And then if they say, yeah, I do have a habit with TikTok, then psychologists respond with, okay, psychologically speaking, I think you have a habit with TikTok. That is ultimately as complex as this instrument is. That is kind of what's happening here. Having spent so long looking at user data online, I thought it was important to compare that, the self-reported behavior, with people's actual behavior. And that leads us to study design. So I gathered, well, I didn't actually gather them in a room, that would be crazy, but I gathered effectively 6,816 Americans between the ages of 18 and 60 years old. Now, I wasn't interested necessarily in the phone. People spend 3.5 to 4.5 hours a day on their phone. That's about a quarter of your waking time is spent on your phone. For me now, that is too much time for me just to treat the phone as a monolith. I'm interested in what people do below that on their phone. And so I was looking at apps. So these companies here, we've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X. They changed their name while I was running this study, very unhelpfully. YouTube, TikTok, and Netflix. I asked these 6,000 Americans, I said, which of these apps have you used in the last week? For up to 2 of those apps, I then said, brilliant, can you please tell me whether or not you think you've got a habit with those apps? However, as I say, I don't just want to rely on self-reporting. So then what I also did was gather the data of every single app open and app close that they had on their phones. So as well as asking them, do you have a habit with Facebook? I was then able to say, okay, how many times did you use Facebook? When did you use Facebook? Over quite a long period of time. So I was able to compare what their stated behavior was to their actual behavior. Okay, this graph, not actually hugely relevant, but I just thought it was a little bit interesting. So these are the answers to the question, I have used this app in the last week. So this is self-reported usage, but I just thought it was interesting to kind of confirm some of the stereotypes we have about these apps. So one of the stereotypes is young people don't use Facebook anymore. Actually, yeah, sort of. You see, this bar here is much lower than all the other bars. The most intense usage in terms of self-reported amount of usage comes through Facebook and for 50 to 60-year-olds. So actually, that is who is using Facebook to a huge extent. Young people use Instagram and TikTok. Yeah, not far off. As you'll see, there's a huge age-based attenuation there, big drop-off. And then finally, YouTube is just everybody apparently uses YouTube. Anyway, just thought this was interesting. No great deeper points, just thought it was cool. Okay, so one of the main results then, the habit strength. Do people have habits with the apps on their phone? The answer, well, actually, this is a horrible slide for giving you the answer because these numbers here have no units whatsoever. They're not in meters or fathoms or angstrom or any kind of cool unit at all. They're just numbers. But what we can do is compare the apps amongst themselves. So we can actually see that Facebook is the most habit-forming application that I studied, much more habit-forming than TikTok. TikTok is next. Then we have Instagram and YouTube, roughly tied. Then we have a little bit of a drop-off towards Twitter/X and Netflix. Okay, is that interesting? I think it's pretty interesting that Facebook is more habit-forming than TikTok. I think that a lot of common discourse would not suggest that that was the case, and yet it appears that that is the case. However, where I think this becomes really interesting is when we compare these behaviors to other habit-based benchmarks. Now, before I do that, let me offer kind of a caveat and kind of not a caveat. Um, Comparing habit scores is it's that noise. That is broadly how I would describe it. It's done. It's done a lot in literature, and it feels like a perfectly reasonable thing to want to do. To say, do you have a stronger habit with this one thing than this other thing? So the tool, the reason why the self-reported habit index is used so much is it's transportable across domains. So this is all in favor of what I'm about to do. However, I should mention the other side of this. I'm going to be comparing across studies. Different studies have different researchers. They might have slightly different formulations of the questions. They might have slightly different statistical treatments. Most critically, they might use slightly different populations. Maybe one study used graduate students from Yale. In fact, a lot of them did. But like it's hard to compare and contrast these things. However, the point of this is to compare and contrast these things. So I'm going to do it anyway. And so here we see the comparison. We have the apps that we measured, the habit strength of these apps. I will draw most extreme your attention to smoking down here. So there was a study that looked at the self-reported habits with respect to smoking. This was amongst people who smoke at least 20 cigarettes a day or who are taking part in smoking cessation classes. That's to say, this isn't, just your average person on the street who maybe has smoked before, maybe hasn't smoked before. This is heavy, heavy smokers. This is compared to Facebook users where I just asked, did you use Facebook in the last week? This isn't heavy Facebook users. This is all Facebook users. Even comparing those populations, we see that Facebook is more habit forming than smoking. When we look at the average, so there was a meta study in 2011 that looked at applications of the self-reported habit index. The average score was around 3.91. Okay, so every single one of these apps is kind of like a gold star when it comes to habit formation. These are some of the strongest habits that we have measured, that psychologists have measured to date, and particularly Facebook there is off the charts. It is, I don't know if incredible is the right word, but it is very habit forming. So that is one of our findings. I'll have a quick drink of water just while we can marinate on that finding. Okay, so do we know ourselves? Earlier, I asked you some questions about your phone usage. What I'm interested in is, do you know how much time you're spending on your phone? And maybe not you personally, but you across this study. So if you remember the self-reported habit index, one of the questions that it asked was, using Facebook is something that I do frequently. We can take the answers to that question and we can compare it to how many times people actually did use Facebook in the week previously. And we can basically look to see, do they give reasonable, sensible answers? One piece of encouragement, I guess, well done, everybody. The people who disagreed, either strongly disagreed, or slightly disagreed with that statement, on average, they use Facebook less than people who strongly agree with the statement that they regularly use Facebook. So directionally, people are broadly okay. However, only broadly okay. If you look here, 11% of people who said they don't use Facebook frequently opened it 77 or more times in the previous week, 11 times a day. And that is 11% of people who say that they don't use Facebook frequently. If you squint, there's a dot up the top here. There's somebody who opened Facebook more than 350 times in the week prior who said, no, I don't use Facebook very frequently. Ultimately, there is a gap here. They have a broad idea, but people are not accurate in any particular way in terms of how much they know about their own usage. Oh, wait, is there anything else I want to say? You know what, we'll get onto it onto the next page. So maybe this is okay. Maybe we are just fundamentally unknowable creatures. We are beautiful, we are human, and who knows what we're going to do. Maybe this is just a fundamental limitation of people. Actually, I don't think it is, I'm afraid. Or maybe I'm not afraid. Maybe it's good. Again, I'm trying not to apply moral judgment to these things. So if you look at the correlation that we found in this study between people's habit questionnaires, their self-reported habit index, and both their prior and future behavior, you found a correlation of about 0.28. This is right in the range found in various meta studies that have looked at basically how close are people at being able to predict what they both have done and will do online. For background, that 0.28, that is a little bit weaker than the correlation between height and weight. Okay, so if you're imagining a medical study that is trying to look at, I don't know, the impact of weight on cardiovascular output, say, this would be like the doctor saying, well, I don't have access to weight, but I do have access to height, so I'll just use height anyway, and that'll probably be fine. That's kind of the strength of correlation we're talking about here. However, there's a much, much stronger correlation, and that's between your prior behavior and your future behavior. What you do in the past is, in fact, incredibly predictive of what you're going to do in the future. And I actually, in this study, really wanted to test that. I was interested, can I predict how many times you're going to open Facebook next week? And how Instagram and TikTok. I keep on saying Facebook, but we did this for all of the different apps that we studied. And the answer is, yeah, actually, we can predict reasonably well what you're going to do next week. But the kicker is not using your self-reported habit index, not using how you think about what you're doing, not using any of your self-reporting. That information was functionally useless in actually helping us predict what people were going to do in the future. The key thing that's very, very important is your phone records. If I can see what you're opening, when you're opening it, how much you're opening it, how much time you're spending on it, I can do a pretty good job of working out what you're going to be doing tomorrow. You can't, because ultimately your self-reflections are pretty useless in helping you work out what you're going to do in the future. But I can. And I'm speaking here as a data scientist at a tech company rather than me as a, I don't know, researcher or knower of you. Okay, I'm going to have another drink of water while we sit on that. So, why are traditional measurements failing? Now, we're going to enter into the realm of somewhat unpublished work. This is stuff that I'm working on at the moment. So, traditional habit theory, it basically says that temporal stability, contextual stability, routine, this is how you build a habit. So, I brush my teeth twice a day, or I don't know, go to the gym 3 times a week or something like that. It says that what you need is a firm temporal anchor. You say, every Monday at 9 o'clock, I am going to the gym. That's a key way of building a habit and maintaining a habit. You have temporal stability. However, what we found, this is a very complex graph, maybe I'll eventually describe it, but what we found when looking at this, if we measure temporal stability, and then we look at usage frequency over time, how much you're using these apps, what we actually find is the people who use apps the most, they have least temporal stability. So actually we see a surprising result here, which is basically habit theory predicts that you need stable context. But actually, as you start using an app more, we see that stable context, that temporal context kind of vanishing and disappearing. Why might this be? Well, one reason that I'm particularly interested in and think maybe the answer to this is that habit theory, habit measurement, was created during an analog world. The behaviors it was looking at were going to the gym 3 times a week, or brushing your teeth, or washing your hands. They extended to maybe 3 times a day, 5 times a day, something like that. But digital habits aren't like that. We're seeing 50 times a day, people are opening Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. Hours and hours of people's time is going on these things. We are, if you imagine the x-axis of usage, we are extrapolating out way beyond where all of these theories were built, all of these theories were tested, all of these theories were made. So we're entering into this strange new world where people are behaving in a way that is contrary or surprising to existing habit theories. But existing habit theories were never built for this kind of intensity and this kind of usage. What this does let us do, though, and particularly by being able to look at the per app level, we can start to build habit fingerprints for the different apps. We can start to look and say, okay, is temporal stability a feature of Facebook? Is it a feature of TikTok, Netflix, YouTube? So here we see, it's not a pretty graph, but it's a graph. And what we're looking at here is temporal stability in terms of hour of week, temporal stability in terms of day of week. We're looking at a couple of other ways of tracking stability. And actually, we find really divergent behavior where Facebook and TikTok, those really strongly habit-forming things, they really do not show strong temporal stability. These are almost like the super habitual apps where they break free of the constraints of temporal stability. That's quite a mouthful. Whereas things like Twitter, things like Netflix, these are more appointment-based apps where 7 p.m., 8 p.m., I sit and I watch Netflix. There is a fixed time when I do that. Whereas Facebook, it transcends time. It's across all times. It's all the time, all the time. Okay, anyway, that was a brief diversion into something that I think is pretty cool. So, why do I think this matters? Well, firstly, nice and simply, and I care about this, but most people, I suppose, don't. Researchers. I think researchers need better tools and theories for understanding digital habits. I think all of the habit literature has been based so far around, I'm calling them analog, what I mean is really real world habits, things that we do a few times a day or a few times a week. But phones aren't like that. People's behavior with phones aren't like that. We use our phones all the time, hours and hours, hundreds of times a day. And so I think we need new tools that scale basically appropriately to this. Were I giving personal advice about how to break a habit? I would say try to break the context and not the clock. So what I mean with this, a lot of cessation advice for phones and things like that says try to limit your screen time. Try and spend only 2 hours a day today on the phone or something along those lines. Firstly, unless you can actually digitally enforce this, you are not a good judge of how long you've spent on your phone. You don't know how long you've spent on your phone. So this is quite hard to enforce. Secondly, we're finding with these super habitual apps that actually the context is the most important thing. So when I say break the context, not the clock, Facebook spends millions of dollars and has lots of very smart people trying to make its app habit forming. Ultimately, habit forming is about reducing friction. If your goal is to break a habit, you want to introduce friction. So maybe skip the Facebook app and instead just use the web interface or something that's not optimized. My personal approach to this is I have one of these watches, which might feel a little bit counterintuitive, but ultimately it used to be that when I got a notification, I would pull my phone out, I would look at my phone, and then I have access to other notifications and everything else on there. So a simple notification brings me back into the ecosystem. Now I get a notification on the watch, I can look at it and I don't need to look at my phone. I'm not opening a device that is giving me access to the entire digital world. So there are fewer opportunities during my day when I can actually interact with these systems and services. And then finally, for regulators, there was debate yesterday in Parliament about this. So this is a very hot topic right now. I have not seen any research that supports the fact that habit formation really discriminates by age. 50 to 60-year-olds are spending a lot of time and have very strong habits with Facebook. Unless we believe that the harm meaningfully discriminates by age, I struggle to support any policy that basically bans social media for under 16s without leaving anything for grown-ups completely untouched. I don't know if grown-ups is the word, but I have young children and they call me a grown-up, so grown-up might be the word. Yes, ultimately, I think banning social media for under 16s is like taking a sledgehammer when we need a more scalpel-based approach where we actually think about where the biggest harms are, what we're trying to protect, what we're trying to do, and then act appropriately based on that. So let's come back to the first question. Do you think before you open your phone? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear. No, you don't really engage system 2 when you open your phone. This is an incredibly habitual action. You're not consciously thinking, I would like to spend a lot of time on my phone today. It's just something that happens without your cognitive load. I think that your app habits are stronger than you think. I think they're incredibly strong. Some of the strongest psychology has ever measured. There are lots of people working very hard to make these apps habitual. That is one of the key goals of app developers, is to make their apps habitual. So people are working to make this happen, and they're being very, very successful. You don't know how much you use your phone. Neither do psychologists employing this tool. This is a key finding. So, like, if I ask you, oh, how long do you spend on your phone? You have to realize that you are not a good judge of that. You need help to answer that question, and that help has to be tracking. And then finally, your phone knows you better than yourself. Data scientists at tech company knows better. They know whether or not you are going to be using Facebook next week much better than you know those things. Yeah, simple usage records better predict future usage. So, how many times will you look at your phone tomorrow? Well, I think the reason why you're uncomfortable, you're pitting system one, your automatic self. Oh my word.
That's how shocking it was.
Dun, dun, dun. Yes. Sorry, yeah. You're pitting your system one against your system two. Your system one's in control here. You are automatically using your phone. You don't know how long you're spending on it. You don't know how many times you're opening it. Your conscious self, your thoughtful self, the one that imagines who you are as a person, rebels against that. It doesn't like the fact that you're spending so long on this device that system two doesn't know where that time went. So I think that's why this makes me uncomfortable anyway, is I don't think that I spend 3 hours a day on my phone. I probably do. So how many times will you look at your phone tomorrow? You don't know, but your phone does, at least, if that's comforting. You can use your phone to find out. And with that, I think, are there any questions?
Such a good talk. So interesting. Do you mind going to the slide on the like habitual users are the least predictable?
Yes, yeah, I didn't really explain this all that well, did I? I didn't actually dive into the detail. Go for it.
Do you mind? I have a question about like a follow-up question about this, but do you mind just explaining kind of the claim that you mentioned about, I guess the key claim of like habitual users being the least predictable?
Yeah. Okay. So what we have here, temporal stability along the y-axis. So how we measure temporal stability, this is effectively you use, well, let's say you use Twitter 7 times a week. Do you use it at 9 a.m. every morning, or do you use it at 9 a.m. on one day, 3 p.m. the other day, 7 p.m. on the other day? Ultimately, this axis here is trying to work out how regularly do you use these apps in time. Now, what my question was here is ultimately, do people who use the app a lot do so in a temporally stable way, in a predictable way, i.e., I can work out when you are going to use this app. And what you'll see is the temporal stability falls the more somebody uses the app. Now, there's a mathematical reason why that might be the case. If you only use something once, then 100%, basically you have maximum entropy. I don't know if I can just throw out the term maximum entropy, but you do anyway. You have maximum entropy. If you use an app twice, you can either have both of those at exactly the same time, in which case you have no entropy whatsoever, or at different times. The idea is basically there's an inherent mathematical property, which is the more you use something, the more those times are spread out. So in order to correct for that, I built a null model. And that's the dotted blue line. This was basically saying, okay, what does the mathematical reality look like if you just randomly sample from a uniform distribution and you increase the usage frequency over time? And the gap between the solid red line and the blue line, it may be blue, it may not, I'm colorblind, bluish line, we'll say, it might be purple, I'm not certain. That gap there is basically, that represents the gap between real behavior and the null model. Then we can be a little bit cleverer than that even, because actually a uniform distribution probably isn't fair, because people sleep and they sleep at fairly regular times. And while they're asleep, they're not using their phone. So in fact, then this dotted red line is being even harsher with ourselves and saying, let's actually build a null model using real user data, and let's pick a user's data from across their entire app usage history rather than just their usage on the specific app in question. So basically what this is saying, the gap up here is saying that people who blah, 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 oh, sorry. This gap is showing that individual behavioral regularity, people are more regular than they are, more regular than the null model would suggest. However, so number one, there's a real mathematical artifact here, which basically says that people who are using apps are doing so in a more temporally stable way than a null model would suggest. But because of this drop-off in curve, it's basically saying that people who are more active have more entropy and therefore are less temporally predictable. I'm sorry, I butchered that explanation towards the end, but
Yeah, okay. So the kind of effect that is decreasing along this graph is almost like the gap between the orange line and the red line. And
yes.
And you can see that sort of it's like largest from like 5 to 10 roughly.
Yes, yeah. So this gap
Yeah.
here basically represents the largest gap.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I'm a researcher at marketing team, and I have to confess that this morning I even woke up with an intention to check my email and somehow got stuck in Instagram scrolling for an hour. So I'm also guilty of that. Just I don't know if you're looking into this but like from monetization standpoint, I think the Facebook model is fairly easy to like copy and in terms of like their algorithm and like coding it in a similar way. So do you know why other companies wouldn't necessarily like copy Facebook's model?
Why wouldn't other companies copy Facebook?
If it's like so habit forming or like if they're designed to be more addictive.
I mean, so each app, I guess, has its own natural limit. So like we see when we look at these sorts of habit strengths and these kind of ideas, some apps lend themselves. So social media apps lend themselves to habitual use. They have the variable rewards. They're effectively slot machines. You can do that with other style apps. So, what's the clothing one called? Sorry?
Vinted?
Vinted, yes, that's the one. So like Vinted also has the notion it's basically variable reward. You open Vinted, you don't know what you're going to get. Maybe there's going to be a bargain on there. You have infinite scroll. You can look at all those things. So I would say tech companies like Vinted and all the tech companies copy each other with these things. They are all kind of doing the same thing. Facebook appears to be doing it better. They appear to be better able to form habits with people. But I would say that, I mean, you saw reels and threads, and like there was clearly a moment where everybody realized TikTok had hit on algorithmic gold. This is a great way to get people to spend time on their phones. So all the tech companies copied it. And then now all of the tech companies basically have one of these algorithmic feeds. So yeah, why is Facebook better? I don't know. Maybe they employ more people. Maybe their data people are better. Maybe their leadership are better at making this sort of thing happen. Maybe it's an inherent function of the app. There is probably a lot of different reasons that go into there. But I would say the tech companies do copy each other on these things, and they do help build these incredibly habit-forming apps.
Thank you for the talk. I had a question because at the end you mentioned when it came to the personal aspect, you said context, not the clock. I was wondering also in addition, because you mentioned the parallel in terms of habit formation with these apps and cigarettes. Do you think that the approach is more like I've seen products like Brick, I've seen apps like Screen Zen or Focus that completely kind of block your phone? Do you think it's similar to cigarettes, where it's an external influence needs to be put in to transform how people interact with their phones? Or do you think that it is more of a way of activating system 2 more and getting people to think more consciously when it comes to their phones?
I think that ultimately know thyself and know what will work for yourself. I think that some of those apps are very useful. The ones that basically say, hey, look, you've opened Facebook 35 times today. You've now got to wait 10 seconds before the app opens again. I think that they can be incredibly useful. For me personally, I think introducing friction is the best way of kind of helping people cut the amount of time they spend on these apps. So the typical ones are leave your phone in a different room or something like that. How these apps get you is basically they seamlessly make it easy to fill 30 seconds. But what they then don't do is relinquish their hold on you after those 30 seconds. So you can either try and build in a mechanism which says after 30 seconds, hey, are you sure you still want to be on this? I think personally that's less likely to be effective than never getting the first 30 seconds started. And so if I have to get up, leave the room, go and get my phone in order to actually do this, I think that that is sufficient barrier to make it, I actually have to think, do I really want to get up and go and get my phone to make this happen? So at the moment, that's where I would invest my time and effort, is in making it harder to access these things in the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Great talk. I have two questions. One is actually a follow-up question to that habitual user are least predictable. So one of the finding is when you measure a habitual user, like the more often or more time they spend on phone, you measure that habitual, right? So it seems to me like when it's less predictable, would you still call it habit, or it's more like addiction? That's the first question. Second is I want to ask the data accessibility. So it's kind of very valuable to be able to track the app users app they're using data. How did you get that? And is that possible for independent researchers to develop this kind of study to track the phone usage? Thank you.
I'll answer the second question first. So yes, it's possible for independent researchers to do this. This data was purchased from a company called M4. So M4, they install trackers on people's phone. This is with their knowledge, with their permission. Ultimately, people in America sign up for an app called Surveys on the Go, and they can get paid for taking surveys. And there's an option in there that they can tick, which is, can we also track what you do on your phones and then sell that as part of a data package? And or rather Spotify actually in this instance, purchased that data and made it available to me.
And I would just add that our group has made a series of open source tools available to do this across all major video games platforms. And there are open source tools that you can use ethically that allow you to do that with enrolled participants. And this is an area of increased interest the last maybe 10 years at the Leibniz Institute of GISIS in Germany. And there are large data sets available with web browsing data across devices. And also the Firefox and the Mozilla Foundation has collected a number of these data sets and make them available for researchers to study.
And the first question, I think, was when we see the temporal stability when we see that gap narrowing, are we seeing an addiction forming there? I don't think we can say from the data that we have here. I think for an addiction, you need some kind of measure of harm, or you need some kind of something from the user to say, hey, I don't like this. This isn't what I want to be doing, and yet I can't help myself. This is what I'm doing. I don't have that data here because we didn't ask those questions. You could absolutely design a study that would ask those questions and would try to kind of mathematically approach that, but I'm afraid to say that I didn't do that.
Thank you. I also have two questions. One is, how do you think the statistical analysis would have been different if instead of having one app at a time being studied, you studied the combination of apps or just phone usage in total? Second one, I am sort of forcing you to give a little bit of a moral judgment, although I know you said you didn't want to. Since the order of magnitude of phone usage is so much larger than other habitual things, maybe it's not exactly a moral question, but do you think that means that the harm is different, and that's why we're able to do it so much, and that means that we do need different units to study this, or should we use the same units as a testament to maybe this is very harmful or something else? I guess it's more of a unit question. Should we change the order of magnitude when we're doing these statistical analyses uh to consider that gap in magnitude and usage?
On the latter question, I think of phones as less the thing themselves and more as the platform for which we do other things. So there are things that I do on my phone once a day that I'm perfectly fine with. I have children and I check the school newsletter. That I'm okay with. I email, I keep up with work. Things like that, I think, are perfectly well tracked by these digital habit scales. Sorry, by the existing analog habit scales. Whereas, yes, it's the really intense usage. So it's the other deep things that I do on my phone, like TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, that kind of thing, where I really think we need to consider how we measure these and how we theorize about how people spend their time on these. As I say, it's not just the measurement, it's the theory as well that kind of suggests temporal stability should be how you measure a habit, but the reality is different. So I think actually I would break it down based on what people are doing on their phones. And the first question, I knew I should have answered that first because I've now forgotten it. So I'm sorry.
It's just about whether you think the statistical analysis would have been different if instead of just doing one app at a time, you did a combination of apps. So maybe someone uses Twitter once a week, 1 week, but then 5 times a week, another week, but they're sort of compensating by using another app another week. What do you think that was shown in the data, or that would have changed the analyses?
So I didn't look at it in this study, but I actually do have data on every single app that people use. So I do have the opportunity to kind of look at when I install TikTok, or rather when I use TikTok for the first time, what happens to my overall phone usage? Does it go up? And basically this is all additive time, or am I stealing time from Facebook, from Instagram, from Netflix, and those kind of things? Results so far, and very temporary results, not actually published or anything like that, are mixed. It's not like a clear, here is the answer. What I have found, the apps that appear to lead to most additional phone time, TikTok is on there. That's in the top 5. But also the apps are things like survey apps and get paid to do this thing on your phone apps. And it's basically stuff where people are earning money by being on their phone more. So like, I guess this gives an example of why this data is messy. It's real world data. It would have been, I don't know, lovely, but I guess it would have been nice theoretically if the answer had been, oh, it's Facebook and TikTok and things like that. But actually, we do so many things on our phone. There are so many different ways of measuring this stuff that it's stuff like, yeah, surveys on the go that actually gives you the answer to that.
Yeah, so I was wondering what you think about the like what are the opportunities and use of self-reported data going forward? Because I think you are demonstrating that it's an unreliable measure of what people like their future behaviors are actually going to be. But I'm wondering what you think of the usefulness of self-reported data for understanding like people's aspirations for what they would want their behavior to be, because I don't know what the data is on this, but when thinking about like smoking, if you ask people how much are you going to smoke next week, that there might be some aspiration of like, oh, maybe I'm going to quit, I'm going to smoke less. So and whether there are implications for understanding how people think about addiction. Like, so yeah, what you think of like understanding people's future aspirations through self-reported data?
Yeah, I think that to really understand people, I think it's important to have both aspects basically. So like we've demonstrated that if you want to know what people are doing, asking them is not the best way of doing that. But if you want to know what people want, if you want to know why people are doing things, if you want to actually be able to understand if people are happy with what they're doing or not, you have to speak to people. I think that we're in a really interesting time for trying to do that at scale at the moment. So this survey was run in, I think, 2023, 2024. We had to apply lots of attention checks. We had to do quite a lot to make sure people were paying attention when giving us the answers. Running surveys now is something that I do as part of my job. It's so difficult to do it at scale because you just cannot believe that people, real people, are giving you real considered answers. It's so easy to get an LLM to give you the answer. And so actually taking large scale surveys, I think, is just becoming practically really, really difficult. And so, yeah, that's a challenge as well going forward. But yeah, I think talking to people is important. However, I think that only talking to people is severely limiting when it comes to psychological studies about what people are doing, and particularly for habits. If you are hoping to use habits as a form of behavior change, I think it's important that you measure behavior. I think that asking people about behavior is not enough. I think you have to measure behavior.
Questions online?
There are, yeah. Do you want we just go through the US tech companies have been asked by politicians about the dopamine hits that people get from their platforms. I can't remember the exact form of words, but do you think politicians sufficiently understand how platforms work? Their USP is to increase the amount of time people spend on their platforms. Do politicians understand sufficiently how the platforms work? I don't know. I would say that the regulations that I see, as I mentioned, they feel like a sledgehammer when a scalpel is more appropriate. I'm particularly interested in algorithmic feeds, and I see people suggesting banning algorithmic feeds until you turn 18 or 16, and then all of a sudden, apparently you're perfectly developed and can just handle the perfect algorithmic feed, and that's fine. That seems really strange to me. I would much rather see a gradated approach, but people rarely talk about what a gradated approach would actually look like technically. Like, is most popular an algorithm or is it not an algorithm? Is most popular for your demographic an algorithm or is it not an algorithm? Is most popular for your demographic and gender? Is that, like, at what point is this an algorithm? At what point of this is just, well, it's, you know, the BBC News homepage. That's surely fine. That's presumably ordered by most popular. So I guess I don't see much nuance in the way that politicians discuss this. Maybe those discussions are happening in a nuanced way behind closed doors. Maybe they're not. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. But yes, those are the conversations that I would like to see. Ultimately, somebody has to design how this homepage feed is going to look. And just saying ban the algorithm is not sufficient detail to be able to do anything sensible with that. So I'd like to see politicians work with tech companies to say, look, we need to reduce the power of this algorithm. How do we do that? What penalties can we apply? What data do we and do we not allow it to have access to? Could you elaborate on why you state that there isn't much of a relation between age and habit formation? Is this purely based on the data you've looked at in this context or similar studies in the digital/apps context? Because in the general context of habits, not isolated to digital realm, the contrary is what has been commonly quoted based on several studies. I can state that this is wholly based on this data. And I can also say that this data doesn't actually extend down to children. It doesn't look at 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, all the way up to 18. So it only starts when people are 18. So it's possible that there are some discontinuities in these graphs and that actually people form incredibly strong habits at the age of 13. That isn't in this data. I also have to say that I haven't seen it in other studies. I've not seen a study that compares the habit strength that people form at the age of 13 to the habit that they form at 18. All I can say is based on the data that I've seen, I've not seen any evidence that suggests habit formation in digital technologies is stronger for younger people. And how do you balance ending digital exclusion and addiction to platforms? Okay, so yeah, I guess we don't want to digitally exclude people, but we also don't like people being addicted to platforms. As I say, I think that how you do this is through a more nuanced approach when it comes to regulation. If you ban people from Instagram, from Facebook, from Twitter, from Netflix, from whatever, WhatsApp, whatever you choose to ban people from, that is clearly excluding people from the digital world that they are going to get hit with in the face as soon as they hit the age of 16 or 18. That's assuming that they don't actually just bypass whatever blocks you put on and access it anyway in a different way. However, yes, you don't want people to be addicted to these platforms. As I say, I think being precise about what harms we're guarding against. I think that teenagers like to talk to each other. I think that they want to talk to each other, and they probably don't need the state to get involved in how and when they talk to each other. That part, I guess, of social media, I think I'm fine with. Maybe there should be some regulation there. Algorithmic feeds, I think, are much more dangerous. I think that they are specifically designed to basically take your time. That's in fact exactly what they're designed to do, maximize the amount of time spent on them. So how do we work with those, allow people to have access to some semblance of algorithmic feeds, but allow those feeds to gradually become the feeds that they will see as an adult? I believe that the way to do that is through a gradually evolving algorithm that allows greater access to personalized data as somebody becomes older and more capable of, I guess, engaging sensibly. That's my personal opinion on how that would be best handled. It requires nuance. It requires working sensibly with tech companies to actually implement these things, but that is how I think best way of doing that is.
I have two questions. One of them is a bit narrow and technical. Earlier, I think you had like a negative 0.08 correlation between people's self-reported and future.
Yeah.
Do you mind going to that slide?
I do.
What now?
Okay. Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, and then the one before that. Okay, yeah. So I just want to understand the difference between the 28% correlation between the habit questionnaire and future behavior on this slide versus the
Yeah, why was it not predictive? Or
Yeah.
rather, like, given that there is some correlation, we should be able to do better than
Yeah.
when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Probably model architecture, probably regularization and how I actually set the models up. Like,
Yeah.
I think that this is probably just before the study, I kind of put together, this is broadly how I believe this prediction problem should work. I then ran the prediction problem, and this is me honestly reporting on the result.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
that clearly what we could do is just throw away the habit questionnaire, guess, and do better than this.
Yeah.
However, that isn't actually how I set the study up, and so this is me being honest, I'm afraid.
Yeah, okay. And the other question I had was like, you kind of touched on this a bit, but have you looked into or like thought about sort of creating a instrument to measure like habit formingness based on observed data rather than self-reported? Right.
So one of the things that I'm looking at the moment, and I guess it's kind of covered here, is what are the various bases that people use to talk about habits? So one is behavioral frequency. That is clear. Any model that you're building to predict the future has to use behavioral frequency. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. It's not a serious model. I have created measures of temporal stability to try and work out, okay, theory suggests that temporal stability should predict future behavior. Does it actually? In what circumstances? What I have here is sequential entropy. So this is, do I always go Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, Instagram, or do I navigate to Instagram in lots of different ways? And then how does that help inform what I'm going to do in the future? So actually, a lot of the future work that I've got planned and I'm doing at the moment is, can I take these things from habit theory, psychological theory, can I actually create behavioral analogs of those? And then can I use those to basically inform what people do in the future? Can I work it out? But then to also inform theory and say, hey, actually, in this instance, it looks like that temporal stability does not predict habits, or rather, it does not predict repeated behavior in the future at the higher end. Does it at the lower end? Does it for certain apps? So like that is ultimately the direction I'm hoping to go in, is can I behaviorally create a vision of habits and create these tools that allow us to understand habits better?
Yeah, interesting. Thanks.
Do one last question. Thank you for your great talk. I just got a question, or maybe a guessing about the gap between the like 20% part. I'm thinking if that's possible because of the differentiation of the weekday and weekend. Have you differentiated this thing?
So yes, what I have here is, so have I differentiated them? So I haven't specifically differentiated them, but I basically create three temporal features. I look at the hour of the day, I look at the day of the week, and I look at the hour of the week. So by looking at the hour of the week, basically, I'm able to pick up on this person only does things during the weekend. The maths actually ends up getting quite hairy because basically the days of the week and the hours of the day and the hours of the week, they actually wrap around. So like Sunday at midnight is the same as Monday at 1 a.m. So you kind of have to throw everything into a circular basis, and then you have to calculate entropy on the circle. So it gets like a little mathematically interesting. But yes, basically, while I don't have a specific feature for that, I believe that the hour of the week temporal stability should pick up the days of the week and the fact that the weekends are different.
Okay. Thank you so much.
There's another question online. Oh, wait, we're way over time. I don't know. Do we just finish or?
You can carry on if you want to.
Okay, cool. What is the incentive for tech companies to have people think before they open their phones? Can there be a non-legislative incentive? At the moment, the practical answer I would say is there is no incentive. If there was an incentive, it would already be happening. Tech companies know that people aren't thinking before they open their phone. They're designing things based on this. So if it would be lovely if we lived in a world, maybe it'd be lovely, sure. If we lived in a world whereby people who realized I'm using Facebook 50 times a day, then said, that's it, I'm deleting Facebook, I'm going cold turkey. If that were the case, Facebook would know that. Then they would say, you're using Facebook a little bit too much. Really, we want you to ease off. So we're going to introduce friction. We're going to make your experience worse so that you use Facebook less often. I guess is that better? I don't know if that's better. That sounds a little skeevy, I would say. But yeah, what is the incentive for tech companies? At the moment, I don't think there is one. I think that they monetize based on amount of time spent. I think they retain based on amount of time spent. They are incentivized to take as much of your time as they possibly can. Yeah, does the government have to step in? Probably.
I was just saying, it's actually worse than the questioner.
Mm-hmm.
You can see in the Facebook files that they're aware of this problem and they don't want people to burn out on their app and switch to another. So they're concerned about this in terms of competitive advantage. They want to be just not burn outy enough so that you don't convert outside of one of the ecosystems. So they've bumped up against this, and there's a business case for 90 minutes of engagement.
Yeah, they don't want any more than that because eventually
they'll burn people out.
Yeah.
And then when people get burned out, they don't stop using social media, but they use the competitors.
I mean, you could just buy all the competitors as well. That's an option.
Well, that might actually be a plan.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.